Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a series put out by Extra History. There are 3 parts, I believe. We'll be watching part 1 today, the Failed Checkmate. As always, I will leave a link to Extra History's original content down in the description below, as well as a link to the other parts to this series as they become available. I highly encourage you to go over to Extra History and show them some support if you like this reaction. We do want to show our original content creators our support. So, Cuban Missile Crisis. This is probably about as close as the world's ever come to nuclear war. It happened during the Kennedy administration, and it was a huge crisis. And those of us in the present period looking back at it, I don't think we can always really appreciate how terrifying it was to be alive at that time. If you're familiar with Stephen King's novel 11/22/63, about a time traveler who goes back to interfere with the Kennedy assassination, he actually does a really good job in that novel of portraying how this affects the people, because his time-traveling protagonist is waiting for his opportunity to interfere with the assassination, and he lives through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he wakes up, the news of the crisis is going on. He is nonplussed about it because he knows how it's going to end. And he's initially completely confused by how everybody else is reacting, how freaked out everybody is. And it's only as he comes to realize, hey, the reason I'm not freaked out about this is because I know how it's going to end. They don't. As far as they know, this is it. This is the end of the world. And that was very much on the mind of the people back then. My father lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my mother told me many times that just how terrified they were. I was born just a few years after that. So when we're talking about this, we got to understand that we're looking back at it. We know how it ends. If you're living at that time, you don't know how this is going to end. It was a terrifying time to be alive. Anyway, enough about that. Let's just go ahead and get into this and see where Extra History takes us. I've seen a lot of their videos. I haven't seen this one, but I like everything they do. They always do great work.
April 1962. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev is walking near his villa on the Black Sea. He looks across the water. On the far shore is Turkey, where, months before, President Kennedy had stationed nuclear missiles. Their warheads threaten Moscow. And he wonders, why then can't we do the same in Cuba? And the world slips 1 minute closer to midnight.
Yep. And that's an important context. The United States had already set up nuclear missiles in Turkey within easy shooting range of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union saw this as provocative. They did not like us having nuclear missiles parked right in their backyard. So they're going to do the same to us. And we're going to react about as well as you think we would react to something like that. But we've got to understand that this was, at least in part, a reaction to our action in putting nuclear missiles on their doorstep.
This Cold War series is brought to you by Dominations. If you want to get your Khrushchev on, check out the link in the description. Remember when we did that Berlin airlift episode?
No, because I didn't see that one, but I will have to check that out because that's related.
Well, the folks at Dominations wanted to keep this Cold War party going, so for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All right.
A time when, for 13 days, 2 great powers hurtled toward a global suicide pact. And it started with a bluff. Following the launch of Sputnik in 1957, Khrushchev had regularly bragged to foreign press about the Soviet missile system. His rockets could hit a fly 8,000 miles away, he said, and Moscow was cranking them out like sausages. In reality, though, his intercontinental missiles were super inaccurate and took hours to launch. In the event of a war, they'd probably be destroyed while fueling, meaning that they weren't much of a deterrent against an American first strike. These long-range missiles were little more than an empty threat.
Literally, in some cases, a lot of the missiles you see in some of the old Soviet propaganda, like those military parades in Red Square, were fake. They were created to create the illusion of power. And everybody's done that throughout the history of war, and the Cold War was a war. It was more of a war of misinformation and through proxies and spycraft and stuff like that, but it was still a war. We were still in a huge world-spanning conflict.
But Khrushchev did have reliable medium and intermediate range missiles, and if he could station those in Cuba, he could credibly threaten the United States in much the same way NATO had encircled and threatened the Soviet Union. From that position of power, he could probably negotiate for Berlin, or demand that Kennedy withdraw his missiles from Turkey. And, as a bonus, the US would never again dare to invade Cuba. But deploying them openly was not an option. Couldn't risk Kennedy doing something rash. No, Khrushchev would have to sneak them in, and only unveil them once they were operational. It would be a checkmate, provided the secret held. On an undisclosed date in Havana, Fidel Castro sits in his office. The man across from him, traveling undercover as an agricultural engineer, is the head of Soviet rocket forces, and he's just offered to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. Castro is skeptical. If the Yankees discover a secret deployment, they'll think that the missiles are intended for a first strike.
Yeah, so that's Castro, and then the guy next to him, I'm pretty sure, is Che Guevara. They are pretty much the leaders in this, along with Raul Castro, Fidel's brother.
Besides, Cuba doesn't need nuclear weapons, and he wants to look like a Soviet ally, not a puppet. Wouldn't a defense treaty be better? The Russian says no, these weapons will counteract imperialist aggression, protecting both nations. Castro withdraws to confer, and then delivers his answer. Cuba will help defend world revolution. Khrushchev will have his Caribbean fortress.
Yay.
On August 25th in Sevastopol, a timber freighter pulls out of port, riding high on the water. Deep in its hold lie medium-range rockets, so long that they have to be propped up against a bulkhead. It's only one of 85 commercial ships ferrying troops and equipment to Cuba. The luckiest of these soldiers travel on cruise ships disguised as tourists, but the majority are crammed into sweltering freighters. By early September, the missile...
Yeah, so they weren't just smuggling weapons, nuclear missiles. They were also, smuggling Soviet troops and specialists to help set them up, train the Cubans on how to use them, and better prepare the Cuban military for dealing with those pesky Americans. Remember, this is all in the wake of the Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. United States was not happy having a communist country right off the coast of the country, 65 miles off of Florida. So they were doing everything they could to bring down Castro, whether it's invasions like the Bay of Pigs, or if it's multiple assassination attempts. They're doing everything they can to bring down Castro, and the Soviet Union is going to take advantage of this. They're going to use this to convince Castro to let them get a foothold in here.
Begin arriving, and they're not alone. 42,000 Soviet troops come ashore, dressed in civilian clothes or Cuban army uniforms. They unload their cargoes by night. Helicopters, bombers, patrol boats, anti-aircraft guns, fighter jets, and medium-range ballistic missiles. The work begins. On October 16th at 11:50 a.m. in the Oval Office, President Kennedy and a handful of advisors sit at the briefing table, looking at blown-up photos from a U-2 spy plane. A CIA analyst lays it out. These are medium-range missiles with a range of 1,174 miles. If one launches, it can hit Washington in 13 minutes. Kennedy is furious.
Yeah, but they're blown up pictures, but the original images they have are still very hard to recognize. You need to be a specialist to really understand what you're looking at. Later on, they're going to send U-2 spy planes over and get better images, but the initial ones, if you don't know what you're looking at, you're probably not going to recognize them. They were pretty well hidden and camouflaged.
Khrushchev's betrayal. The midterms are coming up, and his political rivals have made the Soviet buildup in Cuba a campaign issue. They accuse him of letting the Soviets install missile platforms 90 miles from Florida. Privately, Khrushchev had told Kennedy that the buildup was defensive, meant to avoid another American invasion, and that it wouldn't include missiles. With this assurance in hand, Kennedy had drawn a red line, pledging to take action if the Soviets stationed nuclear weapons in Cuba. He had made that pledge thinking that he'd never have to go through with it. "When will they be operational?" Kennedy asks. The analyst replies, "Once the warheads are attached, within hours." The defense secretary cuts in. If there's going to be an airstrike, it must happen before the missiles are operational. But there is evidence that the warheads aren't on site yet. He thinks that Kennedy still has time to plan. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs disagrees. Most of the rocket infrastructure is already in place. He thinks that the president should either order an airstrike, or maybe an airstrike followed by an invasion. "We are certainly going to do option 1, says Kennedy. "We're going to take out those missiles." They reconvene that night. At 6:30 p.m. in the White House, gathered around in the cabinet room are 14 men, 9 from the National Security Council, and 5 other key experts. It's the first meeting of what will be known as the Executive Committee of the National
ExComm.
Security Council, or ExComm. Kennedy secretly turns on a tape recorder, preserving the meeting. The Joint Chiefs state their unanimous position. An airstrike on the missile sites won't work. Khrushchev could just send more missiles to replace the destroyed ones, and Soviet bombers in Cuba could still hit Florida. They recommend 800 sorties destroying all Soviet power on the island, followed by an invasion. Kennedy's brother, Bobby, the Attorney General, loves this plan, because he hates Castro. But
so Bobby Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy was a very interesting guy. He tended to run hot a lot initially on a lot of these events during his lifetime, but he usually comes around. But yeah, he's initially all for invasion. It's only later that he and John kind of swing around to let's not poke the bear.
The others point out that airstrikes are never 100% effective. Some Russian missiles might survive it and launch a counterstrike. And of course, if Soviet soldiers are manning the missiles, killing them in an airstrike could lead to war. The Secretary of State asks whether doing nothing is an option. After all, those missiles don't really change the strategic balance. Is getting nuked from Cuba any different than getting nuked from Russia? Kennedy agrees it isn't, but he had pledged to take action, and if he reneges, Khrushchev might see it as weakness and start sending missiles to hotspots everywhere. So 3 plans are developed. First, diplomacy. Low chance of success, but low risk of war also. Second, instituting a naval blockade to stop any more weapons.
Yeah, a naval blockade, but they call it a quarantine. Why? Because blockade implied a state of war already. Kennedy consciously chooses to use the word quarantine so as not to make it sound like it's an act of war.
Weapons from coming in, and calling for the missiles' removal. Publicly warned that any offensive move against the US would lead to a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. Third, an airstrike with an optional invasion. ExComm goes back and forth, debating possible outcomes, but Kennedy keeps coming back to Khrushchev's thinking. Why would he do this? It would be like the US putting missiles in Turkey. We did, points out the National Security Advisor. On October 17th at 12 p.m. in the Caribbean, 40 US warships plunge toward a tiny island. The Marines inside check their weapons. Soon they'll storm ashore and remove the island's dictator. It's just an exercise, one that was scheduled before the crisis. But in Washington, ExComm is still discussing whether they'll do this for real. On October 19th at 9:45 a.m. in the White House, the new intelligence reports are ominous. Fresh U-2 photos show 2 medium-range missiles are now operational. The Soviets are also building several launch sites for intermediate-range missiles that can hit almost all of the continental US. Those missiles aren't ready yet, but the decision window is closing. In the last several days, discussions in ExComm have increasingly turned away from the airstrike invasion option. Even Bobby has come around on that one. The blockade, at least, leaves room to negotiate. But the Joint Chiefs still push for war. Kennedy expresses his biggest concern. If he attacks Cuba, Khrushchev will attack Berlin, and that'll leave only one alternative: a nuclear strike. The Air Force Chief of Staff pushes back. If it came to it, they could wipe out the Soviets. Besides, a blockade will communicate weakness. He compares it to Nazi appeasement, which is a shot at Kennedy's father, who once advocated negotiating with Hitler. But
yeah, so very complicated situation. There's not a lot of good options here because you are flirting with, best case, another world war. Worst case, you're flirting with thermonuclear destruction. Not a lot of good options here. Pretty much any directly aggressive option is going to lead to some kind of a conflict, which is going to escalate out of control almost certainly.
Kennedy knows that winning a nuclear war might still mean millions of American deaths. The general responds that the Air Force will be ready for an attack in 2 days, if ordered. These brass hats have one advantage, Kennedy says after the meeting. If we listen to them, none of us will be alive later to tell them they were wrong.
He did say that, and that's a perfect point. You know, Kennedy really didn't live long enough to do a lot. He was only president for part of one term before he was assassinated. He was the youngest president ever elected to that office. And he kind of brought this idealism to the office that had been missing. But his early period didn't go so well with the Bay of Pigs and all of that. He was under a lot of pressure to show that he was strong. But he was also a pragmatic enough man to understand that you can take that too far. If you let your fear of appearing weak push you to cross a line that can get everybody killed. So, like him or hate him, Kennedy was probably a good person for this particular time, for this particular crisis, because he understood the gravity of the situation and just how delicate and dangerous it really was, because it was extremely delicate and dangerous.
Needs to make a decision. On October 20th at 9 a.m. in Cuba, the 79th Missile Regiment gathers around a political officer. He stands on a mound of dirt brought from the Soviet Union, a reminder that these men are here to defend their homeland. He makes an announcement. Their 8 medium-range missiles are combat-ready. We may die martyrs, he says, but we won't abandon Cuba to the imperialists. His troops applaud. On October 22nd at 10 p.m. in the Kremlin, Khrushchev has received intelligence reports of unusual activity all over the U.S. Congressmen are apparently boarding Air Force jets back to Washington. Naval maneuvers are happening in the Caribbean, and civilians are evacuating Guantanamo Bay. Kennedy is scheduled to broadcast a television address at 2 a.m. Moscow time. The U.S. Embassy has told him to expect a communication an hour before. Khrushchev calls a meeting of the Presidium, the highest committee of the Communist Party. The missiles have been discovered, he says. An invasion of Cuba is imminent.
Right, it was obvious to them by that time that their missiles had been discovered. The signs were there. And Khrushchev was a World War II veteran. I believe he was Ukrainian, but he was born basically to peasant family, came from a very hard background. He managed to survive the Stalin regime and rise to power within the Communist Party. Famously, when Stalin dies, he enters a period of de-Stalinization. He gives a famous speech about the cult of personality and the dangers of men like Stalin. And he is a reformer, although he's by no means an extreme reformer. He wants to make life better for the Soviet citizens, but he can be pretty brutal at times in trying to do it, and he wants to make it better by his standards, which may not be necessarily what everybody wants. Khrushchev looking into his life and some of his story is actually pretty fun. Some of the things that he's done, famously throwing a shoe during a debate, visiting Disneyland. And by visiting Disneyland, I mean he actually tried to get to visit Disneyland. He was barred, and he was very upset by that. I think America missed an opportunity there to completely convert the Soviets to Disney. Maybe it was better we kept him out of it, I don't know. But I think that would it gives you kind of a glimpse of the kind of person he was. And he wrote an article for, I want to say it was Time magazine, it might have been Life, one or the other, where he talked about some of his life and experiences. And it's really a fascinating read. It's well worth looking into if you ever get an opportunity to. You can find copies of it online. In fact, if I can find a copy of it, I'll add it to the description just for the fun of it.
Highest committee of the Communist Party. The missiles have been discovered, he says. An invasion of Cuba is imminent. He runs through his options, from announcing a mutual defense pact with Cuba over the radio to transferring the missiles to Cuban control and letting them defend their own country. The best course, he says, is to disallow Soviet troops from using the long-range missiles, but permit them to use their short-range tactical nuclear weapons in the event of an invasion. His defense minister, Malinovsky, cuts in. Putting that decision in the hand of commanders might accidentally precipitate a conflict.
Yeah.
He suggests waiting for Kennedy's message. It arrives an hour before Kennedy's broadcast. Not an invasion, but an ultimatum. There'll be no war tonight, but also no sleep. Because there are 14 Soviet freighters inbound for Cuba right now. One carries nuclear warheads 3 times more powerful than all the bombs ever dropped in history. And it is heading toward an American blockade.
All right.
This episode was brought to you by Dominations. Click the link in the description to play the game for free.
All right. That was good. Good introduction. Yeah. I can't wait to see what else we're going to talk about, because there is so much going on with the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's going to be a lot of very close calls. There's going to be spy planes shot down. There's going to be a sub that very nearly launches nuclear missiles. There's going to be another spy plane that gets lost and ends up over Soviet airspace by accident, which is going to appear quite provocative to the Soviets. So much goes on during this period, and we come so close to nuclear war several times. So I can't wait to see where he takes this. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all for part 2. Till then, so long for now. Bye-bye.